The most powerful promoter in boxing leaned across the table, slid a contract toward Theo Sutton, and told him that all he had to do to become champion of the world was lose. Not lose everything, just one round, one fight, one carefully arranged night, where Theo would go down in the fifth against a lesser man, take the payday, and in exchange, get handed the title shot he'd bled 15 years for. Theo looked at the contract. He looked at the man across the table who had made and destroyed 100 fighters and never once paid for any of it. And then, Theo did the thing that nobody in that sport had done in 30 years. He said no, and he walked out not knowing that the man he'd just refused would spend the next year trying to end not only his career, but his life. How Theo Sutton fought his way out of that, and the woman who put herself between him and a bullet to help him do it, is a story you need to hear all the way to the end. Subscribe right now and stay with me all the way to the final bell, because when the truth finally comes out in the middle of that ring in front of the whole world, you're going to be up out of your seat and on your feet. Theo Sutton learned to fight in a gym on the east side of Detroit that smelled of sweat and liniment and had a leak in the roof that nobody ever fixed because the man who ran it spent every dollar on the kids instead of the building. That man was named Roy Pittman. Everybody called him Pop, and he had been a contender himself once back before the sport chewed him up, and he had come home and opened a gym so that the neighborhood's boys and girls would have somewhere to put their rage besides the street. Theo's father had left when he was small, and his mother worked nights, and by 11 the boy was carrying a rage. He had nowhere to put the rage of a kid who'd figured out early that the world had already decided things about him, and none of them good. He'd been suspended twice for fighting when Pop found him, or maybe when Pop went looking because Pop had a gift for spotting the furious ones before the street got them. Instead of telling him to stop fighting, Pop taught him how and more than how, why and when, and above all, what fighting was for. That anger you're carrying. Pop told him the first week the world put it there on purpose so you'd waste it on the wrong people and end up in a box or a cell. In here, we're going to teach it some discipline, and then you're going to use it to build a life they told you couldn't have. That's the sweetest revenge there is, not hurting nobody, just being so undeniable they run out of ways to keep you down. It was the same lesson worn into a boy's bones, one round at a time, that would carry a grown man through the worst year of his life. But Pop taught more than boxing. Any fool can throw a punch, he'd say, holding the pads while Theo worked combinations until his arms turned to water. The fight game will offer you money to be a fool. It'll offer you money to throw fights, money to sign your life away, money to be somebody's puppet. The measure of a fighter isn't his hands, it's what he won't do for the money. You remember that and you'll die a man. You forget it and you'll die rich and hollow, and I've buried enough of those. Theo remembered it. It would nearly cost him everything, and it would in the end be the only reason he survived. He turned professional at 19, and he climbed the hard way on small cards in small towns for small money taking fights. Other prospects avoided because he couldn't afford to be protected the way the connected kids were protected. By the time he was 26, Theo Sutton was the best middleweight in the world who had never fought for a title. I was gifted the way. Only a few fighters in a generation are gifted. Fast, precise, a counterpuncher with a chin like a cinder block and ring intelligence that made opponents look like they were fighting in a dream. He had won every fight, most of them convincingly, some of them spectacularly. He should have been champion already. There was only one reason he wasn't, and the reason had a name: Sal Marchetti. Sal Marchetti was boxing. He was the sport's most powerful promoter, a man who controlled the champions, the venues, the television deals, and through a web of relationships that everyone knew about, and no one could prove, the sanctioning bodies that awarded the titles and the judges who scored the fights. For 30 years, no fighter had become a champion in the middleweight division without Sal Marchetti's blessing, and Marchetti's blessing came at a price: a piece of the fighter, a piece of the purse, and above all, obedience. Marchetti did not want great fighters. Great fighters were unpredictable. Marchetti wanted owned fighters, men whose careers he controlled so completely that he could decide who won, who lost, and when, arranging the outcomes to maximize the money and minimize the risk, treating the most brutal, honest sport in the world as a rigged casino where the house always knew the result before the bell rang. Theo Sutton was a problem for Sal Marchetti, and he was a problem for a specific reason: he was too good to ignore and too honest to buy. Marchetti had tried for years to bring Theo into his stable on Marchetti's terms, and Theo on Pop's advice, and his own instinct had kept his independence fighting under a small, honest promoter, taking the fights he could get. Waiting for the title shot his record had earned 10 times over. And Marchetti had made sure that title shot never came, because a champion he didn't control was worthless to him. And worse than worthless, a champion he didn't control was a threat to the whole rigged system, living proof that a man could get to the top without kneeling. Theo had watched what Marchetti's ownership did to a man up close, because his closest friend in the sport had been one of the owned. His name was Dion Rivers, and he and Theo had come up together in Pop's gym, 2 furious kids who'd learned to box side by side. But where Theo had stayed independent, Dion had taken Marchetti's deal at 22, because Dion had a mother with medical bills and no patience for the long road, and Marchetti's money had looked like salvation. For a few years it was. And then Marchetti started asking for the other thing. The fights thrown, the rounds given away, the career bent into whatever shape served the machine, and Dion, who had been a real fighter once, watched himself become a prop in other men's stories. By the time Theo sat across from Marchetti, Dion Rivers was 30, used up, discarded, a cautionary tale who couldn't look his old friend in the eye. Theo never judged him. He knew the bills had been real and the choice had been cruel, but he also knew, watching Dion's hollow eyes, exactly what Pop had meant about the men who died rich and hollow, and that knowledge was sitting in his chest the day Marchetti slid the contract across the table. Dion would matter later, because a discarded man with nothing left to lose is exactly the kind of man who, given one chance to reclaim his soul, will take it. Which is how Theo ended up across the table from Sal Marchetti, being offered the deal that opens this story. Marchetti had finally decided to let Theo have his shot, the mandatory challenger position for the middleweight title, the fight Theo had earned and been denied for years. But the offer came with the contract, and the contract came with a condition that was never written down and was made instead in words in a private room with Marchetti's smile and his soft voice. Theo would get the title shot, but first there would be a tune-up fight, a stay-busy bout against a fighter Marchetti chose, and in that fight, Theo would go down in the 5th round. It would be scored as a shocking upset. Marchetti would clean up on the betting, a heavy favorite going down draws enormous action, and it would establish for anyone watching that Theo Sutton could be delivered to the canvas when Marchetti wanted him there. It would make Theo in a single arranged night into exactly what Marchetti collected an owned man, and then, and only then, would the title shot be his. Theo looked at the contract for a long time. Then he stood up and he said the sentence that started the war. "My trainer buried a lot of men who died rich and hollow," Theo said. "I'm not going to be one of them. Find another puppet, Sal. I'll take the title the only way I've ever taken anything, with my own 2 hands on my own 2 feet. And he walked out. You do not say no to Sal Marchetti. Theo knew that. What he did not fully understand, walking out of that room with his pride intact, was how far a man like Marchetti would go to make an example of a fighter who had made him look weak. It started with the blackball. The title shot vanished, of course. Marchetti made sure the sanctioning body found a reason to strip Theo of his mandatory position and hand it to a fighter Marchetti owned. Then the fights themselves started drying up. Opponents pulled out. Venues that had booked Theo suddenly had scheduling conflicts. Television wouldn't touch him. The small, honest promoter who represented Theo found himself frozen out of every deal in the sport, pressured by Marchetti's network, until in tears he told Theo he couldn't keep the lights on and had to let him go. A fighter cannot fight if no one will put him in the ring, and Marchetti controlled the ring. Theo Sutton, the best middleweight in the world, spent a year unable to get a fight, watching his prime tick away, watching the title he'd earned get passed around among Marchetti's puppets like a party favor. It is a particular kind of torture that year, and it broke better men than Theo. A fighter's window is short, a handful of prime years, and then the speed goes and the chin goes and the moment is gone forever, and Marchetti knew it, and the whole strategy of the blackball was to run out Theo's clock to steal his best years, not with a punch but with silence, so that by the time anyone would fight him, he'd be too old to matter. Theo trained anyway, every day in Pop's gym, hitting the bags with a fury that scared the younger kids, staying ready for a fight that might never come, refusing to let the man in the nice suit take the one thing he could still control, which was his condition and his craft. Some days, the discipline was the only thing holding him together. Pop watched him and worried because he'd seen what waiting could do to a fighter's mind, the way it turned a proud man bitter, and he'd promised himself he wouldn't bury this one, not this one. And then it got physical because for a man like Marchetti, ruining a career was not the same as breaking a man, and he wanted Theo broken. The injury came during a sparring session. Theo, desperate to stay sharp, had taken to sparring at various gyms, and one day a sparring partner he didn't know well, a fighter, it later emerged, who owed Marchetti a debt and had been given a way to erase it, came in with a loaded glove and a target. I went for Theo's right hand, the way you'd never do by accident, stamping down on it, wrenching it in a clash that left 3 of Theo's metacarpals broken. A middleweight's fist is his livelihood. The doctors told Theo he might never punch at full power again. It was meant to be the end, not just of the title dream, but of Theo Sutton, fighter entirely. Marchetti had reached out from behind his wall of money and lawyers and broken the one tool the honest man had left. That is where Theo met Riley Brennan. Riley was a physical therapist, one of the best in the city at rehabilitating athletes' hands and wrists, which is a specialty of its own, a world of tendons and tiny bones and the patience to coax a ruined instrument back into tune. She was 31, from a working-class Irish family on the west side, the daughter of a man who'd worked the line at an auto plant until his own hands gave out, and she had gone into physical therapy because she'd spent her childhood watching her father lose the use of the hands he'd fed the family with, and she'd wanted more than anything to be the person who gave people their hands back. Theo came to her clinic broken in more ways than one. The hand, yes, but also the spirit. A fighter who had done everything right and been destroyed for it, a man who had started to believe Pop had been wrong, that maybe the puppets had the right idea after all. Riley did not know boxing, and she did not at first know Theo's story. What she knew was hands, and hers were extraordinary. She took his ruined right hand, and over months of brutal, painstaking work began to bring it back. Not all the way the doctors had been right, that it would never be quite what it was, but far enough with retraining and reinforcement and 1,000 hours of patient rehabilitation that Theo could punch again. And in those months, in the quiet intimacy of a rehab room, the two of them came to know each other. He learned that she was fierce beneath the calm, that she'd fought her own way, out of a neighborhood that didn't hand people much, that she understood from her father's ruined hands exactly what it meant to lose the tool your whole life was built around. She learned his story, all of it, the contract and the refusal and the blackball and the loaded glove. And she believed him instantly because she had spent her life around men who worked with their bodies, and she knew the difference between an accident and a message. The rehab room became over those months the truest place in Theo's life. There is an intimacy to it that no one who hasn't been through it understands, the daily hours, the pain, the small humiliating failures, and the small enormous victories. 1 degree of motion regained, 1 ounce of grip returned. Riley saw Theo at his lowest, cursing and sweating and fighting back tears when the hand wouldn't do what his mind commanded, and she never once flinched or coddled him. She'd just say, "Again," in that calm, certain voice, and he'd go again. And slowly he started to notice things about her, the way she talked to her other patients. An old woman recovering from a stroke, a teenager who'd shattered a wrist, skateboarding, each one treated with the same fierce patience, the way she stayed late for people who couldn't pay, the scar on her own knuckle that she said came from her father, teaching her to throw a punch when she was 8. So no boy on the west side would ever think I was easy. One evening, months in, Theo made a fist, a full proper fist, for the first time since the loaded glove, and held it up, and the two of them looked at it, and then looked at each other, and something passed between them that neither was ready to name. "There it is," Riley said softly. "There's the hand." And Theo said, "There's the hand you gave me." And for a moment, the rehab room was very quiet and very warm, and then she cleared her throat and said, 10 more reps. And the moment folded away, but they both carried it out of the room. Riley was the one who said one evening late in the rehab, the thing that turned Theo back toward the fight. He'd been talking bleakly about how maybe he should just walk away, that even if she gave him his hand back, there was no ring for him to use it in, that Marchetti had won. And Riley, working his knuckles between her thumbs, said quietly, "My father used to say the plant broke his hands, but the pension office broke his spirit, because the plant was just machinery, and the pension office was people choosing to do him wrong and calling it the rules. He let it break him. I watched it happen. She looked up. You've still got your hands, Theo. I made sure of that. The only question is whether you're going to let a man in a nice suit break the rest of you the way the pension office broke my dad, because I didn't spend 6 months rebuilding those hands so you could quit. Theo looked at her, and something that had been dead in him for a year started slowly to come back to life. But getting Theo healthy was not the same as getting Theo a fight, and Marchetti still controlled the ring. This is where the story turns, and where it stops being about boxing and starts being about the truth. Because Theo and Riley understood that Theo could not beat Sal Marchetti in the ring if he could never get into the ring, and he could never get into the ring as long as Marchetti's rigged system was intact. The only way through was to break the system itself, to expose Marchetti so publicly that the sport could no longer protect him. And Marchetti, it turned out, had a weakness that his 30 years of untouchable power had made him careless about. He talked. I was so certain of his own invulnerability that he arranged his fixes and his threats and his crimes with the casual confidence of a man who had never once been recorded, never once been caught, never once imagined that anyone would dare. It was Dion Rivers who became the first crack in the wall. Theo went to his old friend, not to accuse him, not to shame him, but to sit with him in the gym where they'd learned to fight and say simply, I'm going to take him down, Dion. I need people who'll tell the truth about what he did to them. I know what he did to you, and I know you've been carrying it for years. Dion wept there among the heavy bags, the first real thing he'd let himself feel in a decade. He owns me, Theo, he said. He's got recordings he can put me in prison for the fights I threw. And Theo said the thing that turned him, he can. Or, you can be the man who helped bring him down and let the world see you. Chose the truth at the end, even after you sold it at the beginning. Pop's not dead yet, Dion. It's not too late to be the fighter he raised. Dion Rivers, who had spent 10 years being a prop in other men's stories, agreed to be the hero of this one. He became the bridge to the others, because Dion knew every ruined man in Marchetti's wake knew their shame, because he shared it, and one discarded fighter can reach the others in a way no journalist ever could. The journalist mattered too. Her name was Grace Okonkwo, an investigative sports journalist who had been trying to expose Sal Marchetti for years and had never been able to get past the wall of fear that surrounded him. No fighter would go on record because every fighter needed Marchetti to eat. When Theo Sutton, blackballed and broken, came to her with his story and his willingness to put his name on it, Grace finally had what she'd needed, a credible, sympathetic fighter with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Together, Theo, Riley, and Grace. They began to build the case. It was dangerous work, more dangerous than any of them fully admitted to each other. They gathered the fighters Marchetti had ruined, the ones who'd thrown fights and been discarded, the ones whose careers had been broken for refusing, and slowly, one frightened man at a time. Some of them agreed to talk because Theo had done the thing none of them had dared and had survived, and his survival gave them courage. They documented the pattern, the strange betting, the impossible, upsets the judges whose scorecards defied what everyone had watched. And they got the thing that turned a pattern into proof, because the sparring partner who had loaded his glove and broken Theo's hand was himself a used and discarded man, frightened and guilty. And when Theo of all people found him and did not threaten him but simply offered him a way to stop being Marchetti's tool, the man broke down and agreed to tell the truth about who had ordered Theo's hand destroyed and why. Marchetti found out, of course. Men like Marchetti always find out because their power is built on knowing things. And when he understood that Theo Sutton was not merely refusing to be owned, but was actively trying to bring down the whole machine, Sal Marchetti stopped playing the long game and reached for the short one. The threats began anonymous at first, then not. Riley's car was vandalized. Grace received photographs of herself taken from across the street, a message with no words needed. And one night, walking home from the gym, Theo was jumped by 2 men who beat him and told him between blows that the next time it wouldn't be his hand, it would be his life, and that he should take the hint and disappear. Worse came a week later, and this was the thing that nearly did break him. Riley, leaving her clinic after dark, was followed to her car by a man who said nothing, only walked behind her close all the way across the lot, and then stopped and smiled and let her drive away shaking. It was a message with no fingerprints. A man like Marchetti never soils his own hands, and its target was not Theo's body, but his heart. Because Marchetti had finally understood what everyone around Theo already knew, that the way to break this fighter was not through his fists, but through the people he loved. When Riley told Theo about the parking lot, something in him went cold and still, and for the first time in the whole ordeal, he was truly deeply afraid. Not of dying, but of getting one of these two women killed. That fear was Marchetti's last real weapon, and it very nearly worked. There was a night after the parking lot message when Theo came very close to walking away from all of it. He sat in the dark of Pop's gym long after everyone had gone and told the old man he was thinking of quitting, not because he was afraid to fight Marchetti, but because he couldn't live with getting Riley or Grace hurt, that no title was worth a life, that maybe the smart thing, the loving thing was to disappear and let them be safe. Pop listened the way he'd listened for 15 years. Then he said, "Let me tell you about the men I buried, not the ones who died in the ring, the ones who quit, who took the deal or took the hint and walked away with their hands still whole and their names still alive, and then spent 30 years dying an inch at a time because every morning they had to look at a man in the mirror who'd knelt." He put his old hand on Theo's shoulder. "That woman didn't rebuild your hand so you could quit to keep her safe. She's not asking you to protect her by losing. She's asking you to be worth what she risked. There's a difference, and if you can't see it, you're not the fighter I raised." Theo sat with that a long time. Then he stood up and he did not quit, and he never came that close again. Theo did not disappear. But the escalation terrified him, not for himself, but for Riley and Grace, the two women who had risked everything to stand with him. He tried that night, bruised and bleeding, to call the whole thing off, to tell them to walk away before Marchetti did something no one could undo. And it was Riley. Of course, it was Riley who refused. "I put you back together with my own two hands," she said, holding an ice pack to his face, her voice shaking but certain. "I'm not going to watch that man take you apart again because you got scared for me. I'm a grown woman. I chose this. I chose you." And in the saying of it, the thing that had been building between them, all those months in the rehab room, finally came out into the open. And Theo, who had been alone in the fight for so long, understood that he was not alone anymore and never would be again. The break came in the ring where it had to. Marchetti, arrogant and cornered, made a mistake. Facing the growing whispers and calculating that the best way to end the Theo Sutton problem was to humiliate him publicly. Marchetti finally gave Theo the title shot, but on Marchetti's terms, in Marchetti's building against Marchetti's champion, with Marchetti's judges. It was designed to be an execution. Theo would get his shot at last, and he would lose on the cards no matter what happened in the ring, because the judges were bought and the outcome was arranged, and everyone would see the honest fighter who refused to play the game get beaten anyway, and the lesson would be complete. Nobody beats Sal Marchetti. He was so confident in the fix that he arranged it carelessly the way he'd arranged 100 fixes before. But this time, Grace Okonkwo had a source inside Marchetti's operation. One more discarded, frightened man, given courage by Theo's example. And this time the arrangement of the fix was documented, recordings of Marchetti instructing officials, financial records of the payments to judges, the whole rotten machinery of a fixed fight captured in the act. Grace had it all. The plan was to break the story the morning after the fight, timed for maximum impact. But Theo, Riley, and Grace made a decision together, the three of them in the dressing room before the fight. They would not merely expose the fix afterward. They would beat it in real time, because a fixed decision only works if the fight goes to the cards. And Theo Sutton had spent 15 years and 6 months of Riley Brennan's hands becoming a man who could take the decision out of the judge's hands entirely. "Don't leave it to the scorecards," Riley told him, wrapping his hands in the dressing room, the same hands she'd rebuilt from ruin. "They already wrote the ending, so don't let the fight reach the ending they wrote. You end it with these." And she pressed his wrapped fists between her palms, the way she had 100 times in the clinic, and Pop, old now, but there in Theo's corner where he'd been since Theo was 11, said, "Any fool can throw a punch, son, but tonight you throw the truth." The fight was the greatest of Theo Sutton's life, and it needs to be told round by round because every round was a war. The first 3 rounds, Marchetti's champion, a powerful, mean fighter named Hollis Kane, fought like a man who knew the judges were his and only had to survive staying behind. his jab clinching, running out the clock on a decision that was already written. The crowd, sensing the caution, grew restless. In Theo's corner, Pop said only, "Let him think it's working, let him get comfortable, then take the floor out from under him." Rounds 4 through 6, Theo began to take over, not with wild aggression, but with the counterpuncher's patience, making Kane miss and paying him for every miss. Opening a cut over the champion's eye in the 5th, with a right hand that reminded everyone which hand was supposed to be broken. By the 7th, the crowd understood they were watching something real, and the noise began to build. In the 8th, Kane, frustrated and hurt, and no longer able to hide behind his jab, loaded up and caught Theo flush, the kind of shot that ends fights. And Theo's legs betrayed him for a half-second, and the whole building held its breath. But a chin like a cinder block is a chin like a cinder block, and Riley Brennan had rebuilt more than a hand. She'd rebuilt a man who did not know how to stay down. Theo held and cleared his head, and by the bell he was firing back. In the corner, Pop pressed a thumb to the swelling under Theo's eye and said, "You felt that one. Good. Now he's got nothing left and you've got the truth. Go end it." Marchetti's champion was a genuine fighter, dangerous, well-prepared, but he was fighting for a paycheck and a rigged decision. Theo was fighting for something Marchetti's man had never had to fight for every ruined fighter, for Riley's father's broken hands and the pension office that broke his spirit, for Pop in the gym with the leaky roof, for the simple, enormous idea that a man could refuse to kneel and still win. He boxed beautifully, the counterpuncher's masterpiece, making the champion miss and pay round after round, the crowd rising as they realized they were watching something real in a sport they'd stopped believing was real. And in the 10th round, with the champion tiring and desperate and the bought judges' scorecards meaningless because Theo would not let the fight reach them, Theo Sutton found the opening he'd been setting up for 10 rounds. He had been showing Kane the left hand all night, feinting with it, teaching the champion to react to it, building a lie over 10 rounds the way only a master counterpuncher can. And in the 10th, he sold the left one final time, and Hollis Kane bid on it, and for a single instant the champion's jaw was exactly where Theo had spent 30 minutes convincing him it was safe to leave it. Theo threw the right hand, the hand that was never supposed to punch again, the hand a corrupt man had ordered, broken, and Riley Brennan had rebuilt bone by bone over 6 months of pain, and it landed clean, the truest punch of his life. And Marchetti's champion went down like a man who'd been unplugged, and he did not get up. The referee did not even bother to count past 6. There was nothing to count. There was no decision to fix. There was only a fighter flat on the canvas and a new champion of the world, standing over him with a hand that a corrupt man had tried to break and an honest woman had made whole. The building came apart with noise, not the ordinary noise of a good knockout, but something bigger. The roar of a crowd that had spent years suspecting the sport was rigged and had just watched an honest man make the rigging irrelevant with one punch. Pop wept in the corner, the old man who'd buried too many hollow ones finally getting to hold up a live one. Riley was already climbing through the ropes, and Theo caught her, both of them laughing and crying at once, and he held up the hand, her hand, the one she'd made, and the crowd understood somehow, without knowing the whole story, that the hand meant something. And Sal Marchetti, watching from his ringside seat as 30 years of ownership evaporated in the time it takes a man to fall, sat frozen, while the building roared, understanding before the story even broke, before the indictment, before any of it, that he had just lost in the one arena. He could not rig the one place his money had never been able to reach the truth of 2 honest fists and a count of 10. He got up and tried to leave through the crowd, and for the first time in 30 years, no one moved out of his way. And then Grace Okonkwo broke the story, and the ring that Marchetti had rigged became the stage for his destruction. The evidence was overwhelming, and crucially it was public, and it was federal. Fixing fights, bribing officials, the interstate betting fraud, the coordinated destruction of a fighter's livelihood, the ordered assault that broke Theo's hand, the threats. It was not a boxing commission matter that Marchetti's influence could bury. It was racketeering, and the recordings and financial records that Grace had assembled took the case out of the sport's rigged internal world and into a courtroom. The fighters who had been too afraid to speak found once Marchetti was exposed, and the champion he controlled had been knocked flat on live television, that they were no longer afraid. And one by one, they came forward, until the trickle became a flood, until every ruined career and thrown fight and broken man of 30 years came pouring out. Dion Rivers testified. The man who had spent 10 years as a prop in Marchetti's stories stood up in a federal courtroom and told the truth about every fight he'd thrown and every order he'd been given, knowing it exposed his own shame to the world. And the jury understood that a man does not confess to his own disgrace unless the thing he's confessing to is real. Theo was in the gallery for his old friend's testimony, and when Dion finished and walked past him, the two men who'd learned to box side by side in a gym with a leaky roof gripped each other's hands, and neither of them could speak and neither of them needed to. Dion had come home to himself. The sparring partner who'd loaded the glove testified too, and the frightened source inside Marchetti's operation, and one after another, the ruined men Dion had reached until the courtroom became the thing. The ring had never been allowed to be a place where the truth could be told without a bought scorecard waiting at the end. Sal Marchetti, who had owned boxing, was indicted, tried and convicted, and the sport he had held in a rigged grip for 3 decades was for the first time in a generation pried open to the light. The judges he'd bought were banned, the sanctioning body that had served him was overhauled. And the man who had told a young fighter that all he had to do to be champion was lose spent the rest of his years learning what it was to be at last the one who couldn't buy his way out. Theo Sutton reigned as champion, the way Pop had raised him to cleanly, honestly defending the title against the best the world could offer, and beating them all with his own 2 hands on his own 2 feet. He used his fame and his purses to save Pop's gym, fixing the leak in the roof at last, and endowing it so that the neighborhood's furious kids would always have somewhere to put their rage, besides the street and someone to teach them the thing Pop had taught him, that the measure of a fighter is what he won't do for the money. And he did one thing more, the thing that meant the most to him. He brought Dion Rivers into the gym as a trainer. The old friend who had been used up and discarded, who had reclaimed his soul in a federal courtroom, found a second life, teaching the neighborhood's kids the sweet science he'd nearly let a corrupt man take from him for good. "Pop raised us both," Theo told him. "You lost your way for a while. So did a lot of us. But you came back, and the kids need to see a man who came back. That's a better lesson than never falling." Dion Rivers, standing in the gym where he'd learned to fight at 11, teaching a furious skinny kid how to make a proper fist, finally became the fighter Pop had raised, not in the ring, but in the way that lasts. Pop himself lived to see all of it. The old man who'd buried too many hollow men got to spend his last years watching 2 of his boys build something honest on the wreckage of everything Marchetti had tried to do, and he said more than once that it was the best thing he'd ever been part of, better than any title he'd chased in his own fighting days. And Theo and Riley, she had rebuilt his hand, and then she had helped him rebuild his life, and somewhere in the 10,000 hours of it, she had become the thing his whole world turned around. It was Theo who said it first, the night of the title fight, in the chaos of the dressing room after, with his hand, her hand, the one she'd made still throbbing from the punch that had ended everything. He took her face in that hand and said, "You gave me back my fists when the doctor said they were gone, and then you stood between me and a man who wanted me dead, and you didn't flinch. I've been fighting my whole life, Riley, and I never once had somebody in my corner who wasn't paid to be there. You're in my corner because you chose to be. I love you. I think I have since about the 3rd week of rehab, when you told me to quit whining and make a fist." Riley laughed and cried and told him it had been the 2nd week actually, and that she'd known she was in trouble the day she realized she was looking forward to his appointments. They were married in Pop's gym, under the fixed roof with the whole neighborhood there and the heavy bags pushed against the walls. Pop stood up as best man for the boy he'd found at 11, and Dion Rivers was there, and Grace Okonkwo, who had won every journalism award there was for the Marchetti story, and said none of them meant as much as the wedding invitation, Riley's father. His own hands ruined his spirit, long broken by people who did him wrong, and called it the rules, sat in the front row, and watched his daughter marry a man who had refused to let the same thing happen to him. When it came time to give his daughter away, the old man stood on unsteady legs and walked her down the makeshift aisle between the heavy bags, and at the end he took Theo's rebuilt right hand in both of his own ruined ones, and he held it for a long moment, feeling the strength his daughter had put back into it, and he said quietly, so only Theo could hear, "They broke mine, and I let it break me. You wouldn't let them. Take care of her." And for the first time in years, the old man's ruined hands were steady, because they were folded in something like peace. Some men will do anything for the money, Throw the fight sign, the contract, kneel to the man in the nice suit, and call it being smart. And some men raised right by somebody who buried too many of the hollow ones will lose everything. Rather than kneel and get broken for it, and rebuilt by a good woman's hands and climb back into the ring to take the truth out of a corrupt man's control and put it where he can't touch it into 2 fists and a count of 10. Theo Sutton was the second kind. And on the night it mattered most, he didn't leave it to the scorecards. He ended it himself. If this story had you on your feet, do Theo a favor, smash that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling me what you would have done if a powerful man slid you a contract and told you all you had to do to win was lose, and share this with somebody who needs to be reminded that the people who rig the game are only untouchable until one honest person refuses to play it their way. We've got more of these coming, good people. The powerful tried to break each with a villain who was certain the game would always stay rigged in his favor, and each with the exact moment it all comes roaring back around on him, and you will not want to miss a single one of them. I'll see you in the next story.